So it's all about changing behaviour, improving performance, improving culture and leadership. So it's the broad gamut of applying behavioural science. So that's me in a nutshell.
Okay, life can be crazy. You're feeling like you're sinking, just trying to find a meaning. It's time for better thinking, yeah, better thinking. Time to tune in. Let's go.
My guest today is Isaac Baker. He's an applied behavioural scientist working at Mapien. And we talk about decision making, how we make decisions, why we make decisions. His job in particular is about looking at behaviour change and applying behavioural science to influence that, whether it be for businesses, corporations, or policy making. His job is to go out and assist with how we can motivate people or influence people, remove barriers to or encourage people to do certain behaviours. Really fascinating talking to Isaac, and in particular towards the end of the interview speaking about coronavirus. It's quite interesting about just in actual fact how he talks about this idea of, what's normal, what's expected within a context, rather than going out and judging behaviour. You're going to love this episode. Isaac, welcome to the show. Thanks for coming along to have a bit of a chat.
Thank you very much, Nesh. I appreciate extending the invitation.
Tell me a little bit about what you're working on at the moment.
Well, currently in my role as a behavioural scientist and consultant at Mapien, I'm applying the behavioural science essentially to the workplace. So understanding how and why we make decisions and behave, and attempting to improve organisations in terms of their internal employees, their performance, their behaviours within the organisation, as well as externally facing as well. So customers, designing and implementing interventions and projects, initiatives that can drive desired customer behaviour. So it's all about changing behaviour, improving performance, improving culture and leadership. So it's the broad gamut of applying behavioural science. So that's me in a nutshell.
That's obviously fairly broad. How can listeners try and get an appreciation of what something might look like that you kind of work on? What's the sort of behavioural change or influence or engagement with how the environment works or how others communicate with others, whatever it might be that leads to changes? How does it all look and how does it all work?
In particular, I'm an expert in applying behavioural insights. So this is a buzzword term, but I'll be able to break it down for you. So behavioural insights is comprised of two components. One component is the science of how and why we make decisions. And the second component is the application of the behavioural science methodology to actually test interventions in the workplace or even out in the public. For instance, governments creating interventions and rolling out interventions to see whether a potential sort of behavioural change intervention or technique actually works in changing behaviour. So they're the two components of behavioural insights. So applying the science of how and why we make decisions to change behaviours, and understanding that science, those research literatures. And then the second component is the methodology for actually testing it. This, importantly, at least in the past, is being relatively rare and restricted, our application of behavioural science, and importantly, the experimentation side of things. So being able to run an actual study within organizations or even for our customers to see how effective is this change to a marketing campaign, let's say, compared to this other change that we implemented. And using this behavioral insights approach, it's not guesswork essentially. So it's an educated guess in some sense where you're using the science to understand what tends to drive human behavior in a certain context. So let's look at consumer behavior. So what's driving people from actually purchasing this product as opposed to another product or even an alternative of that product? And by looking at the research literature, as well as the applied research literature, we can start to get an idea of the key drivers and motivations and the nuance behind what drives certain behaviors. So in terms of buying a potential financial product, for instance, insurance, what's driving people to buy insurance? What are the processes that are going through their decision-making or behavioral pathway? what's going through their mind and what's affecting their decision-making process in buying this insurance versus not buying any insurance, or even comparing two different types of insurance. And when we start to appreciate the drivers and even the barriers, and psychologically what's going through their mind, and they may have access to it, or maybe they don't have access to this sort of to these drivers, as well as the context in which they make decisions. And then we can start to say, okay, let's actually identify some interventions, some techniques that we can use to actually encourage certain behaviors. So we can remove barriers from either psychological barriers or contextual barriers to encourage a certain behavior, or we can pull levers to really elicit and trigger certain motivations to encourage a certain behavior. So in the context of consumer behavior, again, those insurance products, what sort of factors, because there's likely to be a few factors at play, it's never just one factor. What sort of factors are at play driving me to want to buy insurance? Oftentimes it may be fear or peace of mind, how I view the future, and the well-being of my family, my own interests, of course. So those factors are likely to interplay with one another to affect my ultimate decision in saying, okay, I'm going to buy insurance. And then even then, there's another stage of the process where, okay, what sort of insurance do I buy? How do I weigh up these different factors? Let's say on a website, what does this particular feature mean for me? What does this feature mean for me? And I guess trying to diagnose that whole behavioral process, that's a task for myself, my colleagues, and anyone looking to change behavior, because we have to understand that whole context that our target group are experiencing and going through. So that could be employees or customers, whoever it may be. So that's a long-winded way of that answer, but it's all about changing very specific behaviors, importantly. So with behavioral insights, we want to target a very specific behavior. So we're looking at a specific target group or groups. We're saying we're looking at them, let's say, clicking onto a certain web page. That could be how specific are we getting. Or maybe it's even people signing up for an initiative or engaging in some sort of survey. So those very specific behaviors where we can measure it and capture that data, and where we can actually implement, if there's resources and will, we can implement interventions to see in this one condition, this one group of people, they received a certain type of technique or intervention. So it could be a reminder, for instance, a reminder to do some task. And then in another intervention, a group, or let's say the control group, they don't receive any reminders. So by comparing this control group that don't receive anything compared to the intervention group that do receive a type of intervention. So here, the reminder, and that reminder is informed by what we know about human behavior. Then we can test, is there actually a difference in some particular outcome? And then from there, we start to scale those type of interventions throughout our own work and organizations.
So in some sense, there is a hypothesis around how we think people will go out and decision make. There's also hypotheses around what we think might be a barrier, or what we think might be a motivator, and that's tested at phase 1, let's call that. The measures of that, I'll ask you in a minute how we go about measuring that, or how we even go about hypothesizing. But we go out and we measure it. We compare the two groups in a perfect example, and we would see if there's a difference between that. And let's say we're trying to improve prostate cancer screening for men above 50 or something. There might be an initiative that sends out information to men above 50, and it gives them information about a prostate and so on and so forth. And another one might be an initiative about saying, being a more call to action about saying, call your doctor. Maybe it's two brochures. One's got a call to action, one's got just information, and you compare the two groups. And, hopefully you'd find a difference between the two, which at least starts pointing in the direction of, if we want to influence men 50 and above to get their prostates checked, one might be superior to the other.
Exactly. Yeah, that's right. And we can actually quantify how superior a certain type of intervention is. So that's the real value, I think. And particularly in the business world, trying to quantify return on investment can be quite difficult because it's a very complex system. Many factors are at play for a particular outcome. So not one person or initiative can really claim that it drove some very important business outcome unless you create these sort of controlled experiments or even natural experiments where we can say, okay, we control for most factors, and we randomly assign these different interventions to groups, and that really tears apart the causality piece. So typically, if you don't have these sort of, like the bread and butter, the gold standard is the RCT, randomized control trial, and that's where we randomly assign typically a intervention to a group of people, and then given that randomization, that essentially levels out the assumption that people differ on some potential behavior. And when we randomly assign people to these different interventions, then we can really say that it's because of this intervention that led to a certain degree of change in the behavior. And when you go beyond even two groups, so when you have a control group and you have, let's say, 3 intervention groups, where those 3 intervention groups receive different types of information, that's where you can actually compare all 4 of those groups to say that this is number 1 most effective, this is number 2, 3, 4, and here's the degree to which they are effective relative to one another. And importantly, that can actually very easily be connected to return on investment. So in the case of trying to make certain individuals, males above 50, aware of prostate cancer, sending out these reminders or sending out these, say, pamphlets, where the pamphlets differ in the type of content that it contains. You can measure some sort of outcome, let's say the number of people, the number of males from each of those conditions, or each of those groups, actually engage in the behavior that you're interested in. So let's say they respond to the message, or they actually attend an appointment. So by looking at that, you can actually have a nice quantifiable piece of evidence there to say that this intervention is this much more effective than another one. And here's what's shown. It's shown in 20% of people, or 20% more people actually turn up to these sessions or to these appointments. And then, of course, that's related to whatever downstream effects, such as being able to be more, or actually screening for the potential prostate cancer, for instance.
Is it almost like with, for example, Facebook ads, or it might be Google ads, where they have, obviously in their design, where you might be able to run the exact same ad content to a randomized population of specific demographics with changes in just the image, for example. So, if you're trying to sell apples, one might be a bowl full of apples, another one might be, a healthy couple walking on the beach, or what appears to be a healthy couple walking on the beach. Another one might be, some sort of humorous take on, an apple fighting with an orange or something. And by virtue of those, obviously much difficult to recognize how does someone go out and purchase apples, or maybe they purchase them online or something. There would be a hypothesis as to which one's right, but we don't actually completely know. We can only hypothesize. Most of the way the world works is we go, this would be a good idea, or this would go out and motivate someone. They are barriers or they're not barriers. We think something's going to work one way, but the evidence doesn't always prove so. In the example of Facebook, they do some of that work for you, obviously at a very basic level. Well, in actual fact, probably at an incredibly complex level, with all the AI in the background. Is there something like that? I don't know how well-versed you are in the Facebook or Google or whatever it is ads space.
Well, yeah, in the digital space, this is A/B testing, right? This is their bread and butter, really. You're doing it for however many decades. And yep, that's what they do. And in terms of being able to be confident in a certain intervention, with behavioral insights, or just using behavioral science, you can understand probabilistically how likely is this sort of intervention likely to work. Given what we know about human behavior, what we find attractive and appealing, this sort of intervention, as indicated by the previous research and literature, it is likely to work. But again, the whole process of testing it is to confirm in this particular context for these people, is it effective and to what degree is it effective? So there's always uncertainty, particularly applying these different interventions and techniques to different contexts. That's why you need to measure it. So the importance is that it's not guesswork where we have a hunch, we're implementing it and not measuring it. Here, where we have a hunch, let's say it's informed by some previous research, or let's say it's completely novel, but now we actually go through the process of testing it and in a rigorous way. In an ideal world, of course, in a rigorous way where you can actually start to establish causality with those randomized controls and the interventions. However, not every single instance will we have the resources, the time, and the will to do a nice RCT. So in those cases, we can always do pre and post type of measures, and whatever we have at our disposal, we're going to be limited by that. But at least as the gold standard, that's the pinnacle that we can go towards. If not, even if we can't measure any, even if we can't look at pre and post, implementing some sort of intervention that's based off previous research is at least increasing the chance that something's likely to work above and beyond potentially your own suspicions.
What do we know so far about how we make decisions? What are some of the sort of areas that we're like, this is confirmed, we kind of know this, these are our human biases. What do we know to date?
Well, that's a great question. That's a big one. Okay, so I think if I give a nice tangible framework for understanding decision making, it'll be useful. So in the psychological literature, we have dual architecture type of frameworks. Okay, so basically saying that there's this system and another system, and they work together in some way. And when one system's at play, it leads to certain types of outcomes and behaviors. When another system's at play, it leads to another sort. So in the decision-making space, we can think of them in terms of system 1 and system 2. So this is Daniel Kahneman's type of work with diversity.
Is that thinking fast and slow?
Yes. Yeah. So I highly recommend that book by Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow. And the thinking fast and slow corresponds to the two systems. So the system 1 is, actually I won't use the term, I was going to use the term reptilian brain. I've used it, but I'll go with it. The reptilian brain. So this means, I guess, this type of system or brain, let's say, has been around for millions of years, hundreds of millions of years, and we have it in common with many other species. Right? That's why they call it the reptilian brain. And this allows us to really make decisions quickly and survive in our environment. And it served us very, very well as all the other species of mammals, let's say, that have this sort of system. Right? So it's very automatic. It's about connecting the dots, making quick decisions, and implementing heuristics, so mental shortcuts. Because again, our brain is the product of evolution, just with all other species. So we have to understand our brain and its systems in terms of it evolving over time, millions, hundreds of millions of years. So that system 1 is allowing us to be really efficient with our time and resources and energy, because we don't have firstly the computing power to be able to process every single piece of information. Otherwise, we would be paralyzed. We wouldn't be able to make a decision. Whereas our brain has been selected over time and designed to create an architecture that can make rapid decisions to allow us to survive and reproduce and ultimately pass on our DNA. Because those individuals that couldn't do that, as well as others, they would perish and they wouldn't pass on their DNA. So that's a system 1, and that served us very well. So a lot of our habits are at that system 1. It's automated. We don't even have to think about it. So driving, typical example is driving to work. If you've been driving for a while, then the process has become automated more or less. You don't need to think about every little thing that you're doing. Right? So would you relate to that?
Absolutely.
Sometimes
even if a possum goes out and jumps on the back shed and you hear a thud or a bang, your first thought is not it's a possum. It might be it's a robber. Someone's around. It's dangerous. What the hell is that? There's fright as the first response. It's almost like that reptilian, if we call it that, or the automated, quick response.
Yeah, and that's been adaptive. So in terms of understanding our brain and these systems, again, over time, evolution refines and refines and refines our brains to survive in certain niches or contexts. And so given that we evolved in Africa and we split from chimpanzees about 6 to 8 million years ago, we've evolved quite a bit since then. And in that meantime, our brains have increased substantially. And that's what's given rise to what we see today, our ability for culture and language and building the buildings that we have, living in these huge societies. And then we compare that to the chimpanzees, where they're still in the rainforest doing their thing. So in terms of that evolution over the last 6 to 8 million years, those frontal lobes has really developed. And the neocortex is what we refer to it as. And that neocortex can be seen as being pretty tightly related to that system 2 now. So system 2 provides us the cognitive ability and capacity to think about the future, whereas most other species can't typically do that to the same degree that we can. So it allows us to reason those higher order cognitive abilities. It's all about mental processing speed and working memory, executive functioning. So being able to be flexible in terms of behaviours, being able to innovate. So all these different mental capacities have come online over that 8 or so million years. And it's all about that top-down thinking for system 2. So being able to, and you would imagine that consciousness would have arisen during this period, or to the degree that we have it compared to other animals. And like that top-down processing allows us to really think about our decision-making and to slow it down. So we can actually, I think a nice analogy may be the elephant and the rider. So the elephant is the reptilian brain, or the system 1, the quick thinking system. And then system 2 is the rider. So the rider doesn't always need to be controlling the elephant. Sometimes the elephant can do what it's doing because it's useful, right? It's adaptive. In certain instances, we may need to activate the rider, if you will, to be able to control and navigate and, I guess, regulate the behaviors and the driving influence of system 1. So it's not as if when one system's at play, the other one's not there at all. It's always how they interact in particular contexts, in particular situations. So let's say if we're walking down the street and we see a few people, and let's say we're walking down a dark alley, we see a few people, the system 1 can be, it is automatic in that we see these stimuli in the environment. And maybe you feel a chill, we feel a little bit anxious, we have the amygdala firing, and that fear response, it may lead to us engaging in certain behavior to avoid potential threats. So we don't even have to think about, I'm going to do a calculation, there's 3 of them, this is at this time, this is how likely it's going to be. We automatically can just act on that instinct. Whereas, so that can be advantageous in that situation, so we stereotype in that context. However, in other contexts, stereotyping may be disadvantageous because it leads to bad outcomes. And in those situations, we may need to instill our system 2 to take over from our automatic stereotyping and reactions and associations that we make to say, okay, what am I actually doing here? Am I making the right decision? So this applies in the workplace or even interacting with people. Am I justified in avoiding this person, let's say, because of some association that I make automatically? And that's where system 2 can say, okay, hold on, let's slow down the thought process and let's think it through. And going back to insurance or buying insurance, that's when you want system 2 at play. You don't want system 1 at play where you're just using any cues in the environment without thoroughly thinking through the costs and benefits of your situation.
Is there any research that goes out and talks about what ratios we think are at play generally? Is it different for different people? Does it change with training or education or anything like that? You know, how much of system 1 is driving me, and how much of system 2, you know, am I the driver?
That's a good question. So there's a endeavor in psychology, let's say, where we can look at individual differences between people. So one side of psychology looks at the actual phenomenon itself. So let's say intelligence. They look at the construct of intelligence and try to understand what makes up intelligence. And then another field well, another side of the same, a different side of the same coin can be the individual differences perspective. So we know that intelligence exists. Now, how do people differ in it? So what I've just described before, it was this side here. So what systems actually exist? What's the nature of why and how we make decisions and everything else? So in that particular case, it'll be highly contextual, the interplay between system 1 and 2. And I think it's just even a useful metaphor. So in a particular situation, you have to get quite nuanced to understand, okay, what's happening in your brain and in the neural pathways, what's firing, what are you consciously aware of, and how's that impacting some sort of downstream behavior or outcome. So using those type of metaphors or frameworks may not be as useful to understand that particular context, because behavior is very contextual and it varies, and it's very complex, of course. So there's that situation there. So in terms of the balance between the two systems, it will depend on the context. And as for how we differ, that's an interesting question as well, because of course some people are going to have better executive functioning skills, so they'll be able to control and regulate their emotions better than others. So if we use the analogy or the metaphor of the elephant and the rider, and the elephant can be thought of as the emotional volcano in some sense, or the source of certain emotions, and sometimes they can get out of line. And then some people are better at regulating in the top-down fashion those emotions, right? So in those particular people, they're going to be better at not having outbursts in meetings, let's say, and they're going to have better outcomes as a result of that, downstream outcomes. Whereas those people that have no inhibitory control or low self-control, again, thought of as that system 2 type of process, then they're going to suffer the consequences potentially of when their emotions bubble up, let's say. They don't have the regulatory systems in place, or they're not as effective in being able to temper and control those emotions.
In some sense, the emotion or upset, anger, feeling that there's injustice, whatever it might be, tends to draw on system 1 or shut down more of system 2 in that the more upset I am, the more likely I am to say something that I'll regret later. I'm not using my executive functioning as much. Is that kind of the space where emotion plays in that space?
I would say yes. So, and just to ensure I'm clear here in my own explanations, yeah, there's always that interplay, right? In every situation, there's always an interplay, and with emotions and the bottom-up type of feelings of emotions and driving behavior, and then the top-down regulation of it.
Okay.
There's always that interplay, and again, some people are going to be better at controlling that interplay and manifesting that interplay in terms of the actual display of behaviors.
And I imagine there's different genetic or personality predispositions that, one person's born with a very active elephant, so to speak, and others have quite a placid elephant, and it might be a little bit easier to then regulate, or it appears easier to regulate because you don't need as much executive functioning to tame the wild elephant, so to speak.
Yeah, I'll say so.
Yeah, lovely. Okay. So how does this play into, I suppose, how we might go about doing these things? I mean, I can think of biases for myself. And in some places, I think they serve me, but sometimes I might also be fooling myself. If I look to go buy something, purchase something large, for example, my family home, I recall it took me, I think it was either 10 or myself and my wife, maybe 10 or 12 months. But I know of so many couples that go out and they start their journey of looking for a home, and 5 weeks later, they've purchased their home, and likewise, if I'm going to purchase a car, I will go around and around and around and around, trying to make all these assessments, and sometimes it gets in the way, and it might be that maybe I wanted a home earlier, or maybe prices of homes went up, and it cost me more than it could have. What do we need to kind of appreciate how we work and understand that depending on the context, or do we run with it? Can I tame it more? What do I need to do?
Yes. So that's an interesting case study as well in terms of how long it takes to actually buy a house. So I think it's important to recognize that we can separate, in some sense, the decision-making process that we undertake from the actual outcome of the decision. So sometimes, or I think often, we look at the outcome of a decision and say that that decision was the right decision. Well, not necessarily. The decision-making process may have been actually robust and legitimate. So if you were to replicate that decision-making process, say 100 times, then that would have led to, on average, better outcomes compared to some other process that was just informed by guesswork and not really thorough in some sense. So being able to appreciate that the process can be distinct in some sense from the outcome, but in some sense still related to it. So I could just flip a coin as my decision-making process, and that leads to, or at least associates with, a good outcome. However, in the long run, when you replicate that process, is it going to oftentimes lead to that outcome? I would say no. So it's important to recognize that, yes, you still have to look at the outcome to say, is that good in some sense relative to the actual process that you've undertaken? So again, in that particular instance, for those friends that have taken, say, only a month, in that particular case, let's say it worked out. However, that sort of underappreciation potentially, or lack of diligence potentially, when you replicate it over many, many decisions, that could lead to, or it's likely to lead to, worse outcomes than if you were to be quite robust and thorough with these decisions. And that's particularly important for these huge decisions that we make about houses. So we tend to, I think, find that people maybe assert more, and they engage in more effort. They engage in more effort for very small, impactful decisions. So let's say buying lunch. What am I going to do for lunch? And they actually put a disproportionate amount of time and effort into thinking and processing that information to say, I want to buy lunch here. Compare it to buying a whole house, hundreds of thousands of dollars, maybe millions, and that's decades of your life that you're going to be investing in. And then you only take a certain amount of money. So we tend to undervalue the time and that process. So that phenomenon is quite interesting in and of itself. And I think in terms of making better decisions.
How do we explain that? Sorry, if you don't mind. How do we explain why we spend so much time, for example, on, should I get pad thai, or am I feeling like some Indian food, or should it go out and, get a different cuisine?
Yes.
But, it's kind of like, oh, this house is really nice. I can envisage myself living here. What do you think? Should we put in an offer?
I think that's a great question. And obviously so much research is still being done on this, but I would say that we just didn't have the appreciation for the scale and magnitude of that impact. So oftentimes it's prolonged and it's into the far future, right? I can't really feel and experience what it's going to be like, the impacts of this decision, until how many years down the line. And also the magnitude of, let's say, the money that we're talking about. What does it really mean? What's the real difference between experiencing the emotions of and the drivers of $300,000 versus $10 now for lunch? So it's a temporal issue of what's here and now versus what's in the future, and I guess what we see as being the risks. Oftentimes we're blind to the risks, or we undervalue or even overvalue the risks. So I think being able to, our lack of ability to really properly align our behaviours to the actual objective risks, let's say, and those dollar amounts, that's the problem. And I think that's what leads to this discrepancy that we see. At least one factor, potential.
Yeah, because I can see the reverse occurring as well, where I've actively really had to try hard in, for example, purchasing a printer. Because I could go out and spend hours in looking at the printer, the functions it has, the compatibility, what the toner cartridges, the consumables, cost, etc., put it all into a spreadsheet. I could go round and round and round, and I've done so, to go out and save over the lifetime of the printer, $38 or something, but I could spend hours, and clearly there's a loss in there, but that's my bias. My bias is to pull something apart, and I've had to kind of actively use, I suppose, my executive functioning and say, this does not make sense. Just buy one.
Yes.
Buy the wrong one, so to speak. I'm trying to get the outcome, as we say, by purchasing one blindly, which is against my normal heuristic, so to speak.
Yeah, certainly. And I think in terms of making better decisions, creating rules, decision rules and stopping rules, like that's quite important, where you can say that after a certain amount of time of deliberation, I'm going to make a decision, and let's say I'll decide based off some metric or some variable that's important to me. So let's say price. So if I haven't made a decision by a certain point, I will choose the cheaper option. So creating those decision rules and those stopping rules, that can be quite informative. So yeah, giving yourself that time. And I think creating systems and plans and processes like that's key. So that will actually reduce the amount of effort, cognitive effort that you have to engage in when making a certain decision. So that can be applied to small decisions. And oftentimes small decisions can be, where am I going to eat today? So if you, before the fact, if you say that money is the most important thing to me, you can use it as your rule or as your heuristic, your mental shortcut. And if you're happy with that, then to say that money is the most important thing, I want to be frugal, perfect. So when it comes to the decision of buying lunch, I'm going to implement that rule and say that I'm going to find the cheapest option. And that allows us to automate that process so that we don't have to overthink it, we don't waste time on that. So in those particular instances, yes, we can do some planning in advance to say, this is what's going to inform my decision making, and then implement that particular plan. Or we can actually just rely upon heuristics in the moment. So we can look at restaurants that have the most people there. Okay, I'm going to use that heuristic, and it's useful, and you may not even be aware of it, but you could be aware of it, of course, because that's a cue of something, right? So that mental shortcut is useful because it's a cue that other people are buying it, they're interested in it, it must be good, compared to another restaurant where there's no one there. So it sends signals, right? So using that shortcut and the signals that are sent from those two places, then that can inform our decision in that context. Whereas when it comes to exerting effort and energy, that system two, the top-down, really robust thought process, assigning that for really impactful decisions and making that conscious decision that I'm going to, I guess, reallocate my effort and my intellect to those decisions. I think that's an adaptive way to go about things. So things that are unimportant to me, in terms of, let's say, the values that I have, they're unimportant to me, I'm going to rely upon my heuristics, my mental shortcuts, just to save time, right? And my own cognitive effort. Whereas something that's really important, where I have a lot of money on the line or my health is on the line, I'm going to activate in some sense, or really turn online that system to top-down thought processes. And in addition to that, implement some sort of decision-making process as well. Because it's one thing to say, I'm going to think hard about this. But there's the next stage is, okay, thinking hard about it, what does that process look like? And that's it's not a whole nother story, but it's the next story that you have to tackle. How are you going to actually weigh up the pros and cons of different options? What will be your process and strategy in making a decision that you yourself say that I value this decision?
It's interesting because in so many ways I can see where, for example, social evidence, can be helpful, or having a rule around, might be something like, if I don't know, don't go the cheapest, don't go the most expensive, go mid-range. But I'm sure everyone who's selling, computers or whatever it is, they know how I'm thinking. They will give a cheap option, as they often do. If you go to buy a vehicle or something, they'll give you the baseline, right? And then they'll have the mid one and they'll have the high one. And I suppose they're queuing for all of us. Someone does want to come in and say, my heuristic or my rule is I'm the frugal, buyer, and I'm doing that. And someone says, no, I'm looking for, value for money, and I believe value for money is the mid-range one. It's a little bit more, but I get all these other options. And someone's kind of saying, for me, the rule is if you're going to do something, do it properly. Get the whole kit and caboodle. I'm assuming that this is how some things are designed or built, or that's kind of how you assist with some of the clients that you work with. Is that kind of the stuff where you're trying to cater for not only for one outcome, but trying to cater for different people coming in and with different designs, different makeups, so to speak?
Yeah, certainly. And that interplay that you outlined, like, that's fascinating interplay, where you have individuals with their own unique drivers and combination of values, let's say. And then you can also zoom out to the scale of hundreds or thousands of those individuals, right? And where they all vary in their values and everything else. And then from the perspective of helping out the business, or when they're trying to design and frame products, it is a very interesting interplay. And at least in terms of my own work, in helping businesses with how they frame products and how they allow the processes, the sales process, let's say, and the products to align with the values and needs of the customers. Like, that's ideal, because applying behavioral insights is one thing, but you can apply in many different ways. So you can apply it without an ethical lens, where all you want to do is sell a certain product or get people to do a certain behavior that may not be aligned with their values. So that's not ideal, and I wouldn't encourage that approach. And in terms of interventions that change the environment in which we make decisions, or the choice architecture, nudges, that's a certain type of intervention. And when you're being unethical in the application of behavioral science and behavioral insights and these interventions, the word that we started to use is sludge. So we implement an intervention or the design of a catalog or products, and it leads to behaviors that aren't aligned with the customer's needs and values. So that's sludging in some sense. Whereas the ethical application, or the purported ethical application, is where we have the nudge implemented, where we try to align and identify the needs and the values of a particular segment, and allow them, let's say, through our website, to navigate a certain process where they can actually get the top rated or the most appropriate product for them. So a lot of that customer user experience and the customer perspective, and that's what a lot of businesses are trying to do, particularly in the financial sector, where they're trying to align and identify these segments of the people at certain ages and certain demographics. They're interested in certain things, or they have certain values, and they have certain particular contexts and circumstances. And as a result, we want to align them with a certain product, a product that's not maybe appropriate for someone who's of a different age or different sex, whatever it may be. So yeah, that's definitely, I think, a big driver in the financial industry, let's say, but particularly in marketing, communications, to varying degrees. That sort of incentive or structure is actually set up. And across businesses, you find a lot of businesses aren't as interested as in aligning the values. But oftentimes they're not collecting the data on the customer values and motives and what they want.
Yeah, it's interesting, and maybe I've got a bias because, obviously, being a psychologist, I would assume that the holy grail is to align with values. That if you meet a customer's values, at least if we talk about the long term, maybe not the bottom line short term, but if we talk about long term, I'd assume that your growth is going to be greater by continuing to meet values, because at that point you're removing those barriers. You're certainly creating lots of motivation. It's going to be an easier transaction rather than to incentivize someone to quickly purchase something that is against their value set. That there may be that buyer's remorse or regret or whatever it might be. I assume that marrying those two, at least over the long term, would be helpful. But maybe business doesn't always run that way, right? So sometimes they might argue that they need a shorter term incentives for shareholders or whatever it might be to achieve certain things so they can grow that way. Maybe I'm a bit naive in that space.
In terms of what you've outlined, I advocate for, and I agree that in the long term, right? It's all about the long term game, because business is a long term. It's not one decision in one instance. Going the ethical route seems to be the best way. So in an optimally functioning market, that's the best way. Whereas it's all about what the business values in terms of the short term as well as the long term. So let's say the bottom line is the most important to them. And let's say they're pretty short-sighted about it. So they're short-sighted, the bottom line is getting a sale. They don't care about whether it aligns with people's values. They want money. So in that particular case, it's successful. However, when you look at, since this is an iterated game over time, if they keep this up and the market becomes the shareholders, the customers become aware of this organizational business, they have low values, they're just trying to sell products, it's not what we need. If they get discovered, then in the long term, that's detrimental for them, even though the short term payoff. But that assumes, of course, that there's the dynamic in the market where people can actually identify and become aware of, okay, this business is doing bad business, let's say. Whereas if you have an organization that not only promotes their ability to align their customers' values with what they need and deliver that value, but over time, if that's, I guess, well known and established, then I think in that long term view, it's going to be beneficial. So it's all about the here and the now versus in the long term. So it's an interesting balance.
Green energy space has done some fairly innovative things about bringing in people's values. If I think about maybe a subset or a set of persons in particular, for example, technologists, IT, people who love that space, there's a very strong connection with, I suppose, how those persons as a group value green energy. And we've seen the rise of companies like Tesla, where they can produce a car and ask for a premium, some extra money. And as a matter of fact, even Tesla's been kind of blatantly open about this, of saying, we're going to make a very expensive car that's going to give us lots of profits, to then make a lesser expensive but still very expensive car, to then try and make a lesser expensive, more affordable. They're kind of saying, we want you to buy into these value, and they have, people have spoken about it as a cult. And I've got to put my hand up. I'm a member. I'm a member of that cult. Unfortunately, not a paying member. I wish I was, but I'm an ethical or a values or a innovation, excitement sort of member. I like the idea of what they're talking about, and that's a huge driver.
And I wouldn't say it's the only driver too, because of course, with a lot of these motivations, it's all about, say, individuals and how they balance it. So ultimately, we could find in a certain demographic or group where the economic constraints that may overplay, that they may drive, let's say, certain behaviors over and above the values that they have. So even though values may be important and they wish they could do it, however, the economic constraints means that's likely to be driving their decisions. And again, in terms of what drives their decisions and their thought process, a lot of these factors here aren't being conscious. They're not consciously aware of it. They may not yet, so they may have that more implicit knowledge or that tacit knowledge in those type of drivers of their behavior. But in any case, whatever level is that, it's interesting how individuals do balance those behaviors, and are they in a particular context or circumstance where they can actually allow values to inform their decision making.
That makes a lot of sense, because I'm assuming that a lot of the Silicon Valley folk, the economic barrier might not be as bigger issues, because they tend to be quite young, they tend to be on reasonable salaries, and that would probably align with their values and a whole social network of what it all means and so on. There's a lot of moving factors rather than the many of us that probably would like one, but there's certainly enough barriers in the way to get us to hold back.
And I think a really salient example as well is looking at in a different context, looking across countries. So comparing richer to poorer countries. And in poorer countries, they tend to care less, let me just say,
Sure.
about the environment, or at least it's manifested in less environmentally friendly behaviors. And why is that? So they could care about the environment and value it, but those economic constraints of, I just need to eat, I just need to get by, they're going to take precedence over the values that they may have for the environment. But interestingly, over time, you tend to find when countries get richer and those needs, those more basic needs, are catered for, then they start to have the opportunity to express the values in the environment and care more about it. So when you find, let's say we use the flawed but decent measure of GDP to look at the trends of a country improving over time, then we tend to find that they care about the environment and regulations, and those sort of behaviours actually come online as well.
Do you know much about how much government, for example, I know we've spoken a lot about business, but how much did government go out and look at these spaces of, behavioural science, informing policies, informing not only that, funding? If we talk about, the Don't Litter campaign, obviously the uptake's going to be really, really poor in a developing country. That obviously, as you say, the hierarchy of needs, they're on the lower ends, and so who cares if I throw a bit of rubbish and I don't have any trust that anyone else won't either, versus in Australia where it's very frowned upon and so on and so forth, but we've also spent huge volume of money and resources and advertising and so on. How much is government approaching you guys, other guys? Did you have any idea with how do we do some of that policy making to be informed by behavioural science?
Yes, more and more. So the first behavioural insights team that I'm aware of was created in the UK government, and that was in between, let's say, 2008, 2011, I feel, is around that period. So that's where the popular science book Nudge was also released. So that's when it started to become quite popular, the application of this strand of behavioural science and applying it in not only the workplace, but in particular the governmental setting to try to impact the behaviours and the outcomes of the general public. So they created the Behavioural Insights team, and using this particular, or the unit, so using this team, they were able to implement large-scale RCTs to change the general public's behaviour on very particular behaviours. So a perfect example may be tax compliance. So are people paying the taxes? So they're able to change the actual content of letters that they send out. So those letters reminding people to pay their taxes and everything else. So they're able to create several different intervention groups as well as a control group, looking at tens of thousands of people, and to see that in this particular condition where we called upon, let's say, the social norm to say that here's how you scored compared to your neighbours. So that was one group or intervention.
Yep.
And they're able to look at the effectiveness of people that actually engage in the behaviour of paying the taxes for that group, and then compare it to another group, saying maybe drawing upon some other sort of salient cue in their environment, let's say. So all these different interventions that they can implement, or even they may even, within an intervention group, they may layer these techniques. So they may mention social norming as well as how much it may cost the government or the people around them if they don't do a certain behaviour. So that's two types of techniques they can implement within one intervention group. And so that's to change tax compliance, a very specific sort of behaviour. And from there, it's actually spread through governments around the world. So organisations, governmental organisations, they may even have embedded behavioural insights teams and units that are targeted at changing the behaviour of their regions, of their areas. So we could be looking at walking behaviours, for instance. So I believe it's the Victorian government and a unit or team within the government where they wanted to target the healthy walking behaviours of individuals. So let's say it's patients, let's say, and they can implement certain interventions, or they may be reminders or calls to social norms or whatever it may be to try to change the activity levels of that particular group. So yeah, all around the world, they're implementing, or they're creating these teams and these units, and they're running these large-scale RCTs, looking at thousands or tens of thousands of people, and we're seeing depending on the nudge and the context and everything else, of course, it varies. The effectiveness varies. However, you do tend to find that there are certain interventions or nudges that tend to be most effective in certain situations. So let's say the social norming nudge typically is quite effective. So being able to say, here's how you compare to your peers or people that people identify with. Like, that's quite important and quite useful in increasing the probability that someone or people will engage in the desired behavior.
How do we do that at a shorter time frame? You've obviously described how we might go out and do RCTs, or basically do the feedback loop to look at what research is telling us. In a situation like at present, as we're speaking, coronavirus is a big topic at the moment. How would we go out and look at influencing behaviour change that might be useful, about whether it be hand washing or decision making about whether to go to work or not, or even whether to go to the hospital and get checked or not? How do you do that at fast speed? I mean, what influences how we might do that without obviously an opportunity to do randomized controlled trials? Are these previous RCTs helping us make informed decisions now?
I would say yes. So those previous RCTs, again, it's the evidence base about the effectiveness of certain techniques. So if you can actually rank order certain techniques and find that in those contexts it's pretty similar to my context, then I'm going to choose the top 3 interventions and implement them. But when you say us, are you talking from the perspective of, let's say, the government, or are you talking about individuals making better decisions?
Maybe you can talk about both, I suppose. There's all of us are in that space at the moment. Not leaving it up to government, because we can easily point the finger and just say, oh, they're not doing good enough. But at the same time, what am I doing as part of that picture as well?
So let's say that the we can be an entity, right? It doesn't have to be government or business, but ultimately the we is an entity where we want to change a cohort's behavior. And without going the RCT route, we can do the A/B testing, or we can do the pre and post. Actually, that's a nice, useful approach. And as long as you have, again, the resources and the will to collect data on the current behavior now, and then implement the technique or the intervention, and then measure it after, that can be useful in saying, okay, here's what the level was before I implemented a technique. Here's where it is after. So at least in that particular sense, you're still collecting data, and that could be time consuming. Maybe it's not, but if you want to start to establish whether behaviors have actually been changed, you need to measure these outcomes. And also, I guess, at a level that's not as high as that, even understanding what drives people's behavior. So that behavioral insights, that first component of what are some key drivers of behaviors, and then knowing that, okay, these interventions tend to leverage these sort of drivers, implementing those, and this is not an ideal situation, and not measuring it, that could, if you're constrained by the situation, that's our best bet. Or that's a good bet, let's say. So
it's an educated guess, I suppose, is what we're trying to.
Exactly right. So, and a lot of these interventions that I talk of, when we're talking about, let's say, not running an RCT or even a pre-post, and not even measuring outcomes, which is not ideal, but you can still stack and layer these different techniques when you do an action. So let's say the action is an email. So in the email, you can still layer these different techniques. So call upon this norm, or this sort of call to action, or pop in, or tweak the design of the email in a certain way that's informed by previous research, just to try to maximize the input of the output, of how effective that email will be. So in terms of our day-to-day, that's where I see the use of these behavioral insights to be useful for business as usual activities, where you may not have the opportunity to measure outcomes. Ideally you should, but if not, using that approach, the educated guesses, I think will be, it's better than nothing, or it's better than blind luck and guessing.
Is this how some of these, is this what can kind of explain some of the madness that goes on around, some reports, and I don't know how true this is, but it seems that a fair bit of this is floating around, the craziness around Australians running around buying toilet paper. There's fear, which is a great driver. It's fear around scarcity, I'm assuming, because I don't believe toilet paper goes out and cures or treats coronavirus whatsoever. But there's a fear of scarcity, that it won't be available. And if I have to be at home for 14 days, incubation period, whatever it might be, there's almost like a call to action. If you don't go right now, you're going to miss out. It's almost even norming. Other people are doing this. I better. Is this kind of how this madness goes on? And the fact that it's publicised, I think I was just reading the other day, there's something like 9 articles a day, per paper that are going out talking about this, let alone, the social media madness. Is this how this stuff, kind of breeds like a wildfire type of scenario?
Yeah, this whole phenomenon is quite interesting. And
how do you explain it?
Oh, okay, that's a good question. So, and here there are no normative judgments coming from me. So, a lot of people are saying this is madness, this is crazy. Well, I don't necessarily, or even irrational. I don't necessarily see it as irrational. So it's all about what you class as rational behavior. And I think even a lot of experts, they're not viewing risk appropriately. And so, what little chance does the layman or the general public have in viewing risk in the appropriate behavior? So for this, I'm not an expert on risk or probability. However, I can refer to Nassim Taleb. Definitely check him out. Joe Norman as well. So they've and Yanir potentially. I can't quite recall that name, but in any case, they're complexity scientists and they're experts in risk and probability, and they actually go against the mainstream of economics, where the economics may be viewing risk, or they may be viewing rationality and irrationality in a certain way. But that's all to say that when you have these sort of instances where we have the potential for exponential growth, and we actually do see exponential growth in certain countries, right, until we implement our interventions, our protocols to try to reduce the rate of growth. In these instances where we have exponential growth, you need a certain type of behavioral response that differs in degree and type from a behavioral response to a phenomena where it's more linear or even static. So a lot of people that are equating corona to gun deaths or how many people die of this, that, or the other, they're getting it wrong, because firstly they're comparing the raw numbers, and they don't compare the raw numbers, and also they have those 2 different or 3 different cases, they have different variances. So in terms of distributions, how likely a particular event is, and that's really drawing upon the tails of those distributions. So that's the old normal distribution, the bell curve. In these rare events where we're seeing exponential growth, these are fat-tailed, they're called. So these are very, very rare events, and they should be treated differently from, let's say, gun deaths. So people saying there's more people killed of gun deaths than corona, at least at this stage. But they're 2 different phenomena, where one is relatively static or linear in growth, potentially, and the other is, in many instances, exponential. And when we look at the exponential element, that means we tend to underestimate how serious these things can be. So erring on the side of caution is always what I prefer. So the precautionary principle, and recognizing that we're not good at probabilities and forecasting in the future, particularly when it comes to exponential growth. That means we get hung up on the wrong numbers. So we may be looking at the number of cases per day, but what we should really looking at is the growth rate of new cases from one day to the next. So that growth rate is going to tell you how rapidly it's actually growing, right, and how much of an issue it is. When it's around 1 or less than 1, between 0 and 1, that's when the growth rate is starting to decrease, and that's a good thing. When you start to exceed 1, that's when you start to see that exponential type of curve, and that's not good, because even if most people, let's say in a certain age range, they aren't symptomatic or they aren't going to die or be affected adversely by it. So I'm turning 30 this year. I'm relatively healthy. So in terms of the risk factors or of what we've found to predict negative outcomes, whatever it may be, I may not die from it. And my risk is my individual risk is probably pretty low. However, I can be a vector for spreading it, because I can actually be asymptomatic and I can spread it to people that have a higher risk. Let's say the people that are 50 and above, that smoke, that are obese. I can transmit it in that way. So by people underestimating, and I've come across many people, like, I'm a young person. Most people that die are old. However, if you see yourself as a vector, so if you can vector, you can pass it on, and you're likely to pass it on because we're in contact with each other. We can easily pass it on to 3 or 4 people per day, because it's all about breathing on people. We underestimate how quickly these things can spread. So with people going out to buy toilet paper, yes, the toilet paper in particular is an odd occurrence, and I'd say there's something that's path dependent about that. So one weird instance that got some media attention, before you know it, it leads to everyone toilet paper, whereas there's nothing to stop us from having the same sort of response to any other type of item. Let's say hand wash or hand sanitizers. Because rationally speaking, well, not even rationally speaking, if you think about, I guess, the hype that can be spread through the media, that's going to affect people's own decision making, because they can see that there is going to be that shortage, right? And if you know that a lot of other people are going to be going out there to buy it, would it be rational or irrational of you to not go out there and buy it? So let's say everyone else buys it, you're left with no toilet paper. Of course, you can probably borrow it from someone, but whatever it may be, you're left with that resource, and that can apply to any resource. So that can quickly, and at a literal exponential rate, lead to people saying, I need to run to the store now and get some toilet paper or tissues or whatever it may be. So when people say that irrational, I don't tend to agree with that.
Yeah. It makes a lot of sense, because under these conditions, it's very much expected. As a matter of fact, by virtue of it happening, makes it expected, because that's the proof that it's occurred, and so therefore these conditions have caused, it to happen in this way. What's interesting is talking about the actual coronavirus and how we're applying, I suppose, risk, or if we call about it system 1 or system 2, we tend to do a very quick system 1, evaluation, which doesn't go out and compare apples with apples. It's comparing apples with oranges and kind of saying, well, coronavirus isn't that serious because it's killed less people than X, Y, and Z, but it doesn't go out and think more deeply, thoughtful in a considered way of what's the number of, what's the risk of infection, and then the number of possibilities, because that's exponential. If 25 million people were infected, let's say just Australia, a 2%, a 2.5% is an astronomical number, versus gun deaths or whatever it might be. We're not necessarily seeing the whole picture, or even assigning value in the same way in our decision making.
And I would actually say that system 1 here, though, is actually helping us and is driving us in a different way, in a positive way. So system 1 is driving us with the fear, and that's driving us to go out and buy things. So I think that's advantageous. And of course, it's all about degree of what behaviors we're looking at. I think that system 1 automatic response is actually advantageous. And so that heuristic that we're using is useful. Whereas in our system 2, I think, even though maybe I've framed it system 2 as being good, again, if there's a faulty process and we can't rationally make the appropriate decision, not going through the appropriate process, system 2 can be detrimental. And here, I think system 2 is being detrimental oftentimes for a lot of people that are saying, "Is this number here, this number there," and they're not thinking any deeper. So I guess it's all about whether you define that process as system 1 or 2. That's the question.
Is that because if system 2 becomes rigid, in some sense it starts acting in a way of, well, I just know, I've got this system, this is my rule is clever and smart, and so now I've converted in some sense my previous system to algorithm, and I've provided to system 1, and that's how I'm going to view the world. Can it be kind of explained a little bit like that? I suppose that's some of the relationship in between the two.
Yeah, I like that explanation.
Yeah. It's fascinating stuff. Look, I'd love to talk to you for another hour. I'm just mindful of time, and I know you've got some engagements to go to. We'll have to make another time, Isaac, to continue talking about this. But any last things that you want to add to the, at least to give you an option to finish off the coronavirus conversation before we finish up?
Sure. Okay, so recommendations, coronavirus. Decrease contact with others, right? And because that's how these viruses are going to be spread. And so there's the public gathering points and huge venues where you're interacting with a lot of people on trains and buses. That's how the thing will be spread. Of course, wash your hands, all that type of hygiene, and prepare. So this is going to happen for months, right? So be mindful of your own impact on other people. So again, if you're healthy, then you can still spread it on. Well, that is, if you're not displaying symptoms and you're not going to die, you can still spread it on to other people. So we all have a responsibility to decrease contact with others when necessary and where appropriate. Wash the hands, buy whatever resources. Don't go over the board, of course, but buy whatever resources that you need, with the view that this thing could grow exponentially over a matter of weeks, and then think about the next few months. So get your financial matters in order, because again, the economic system will be under strain. So make these don't panic early, but be mindful early before it really starts to accelerate, and you'll be left in the dark with no plan. So that's my recommendation. And as for, would you like me to give like a general farewell conclusion as well?
Please do, if you like. Please do. Yes.
All right, well, firstly, let me just thank you for inviting me on the podcast, and I hope that it's been informative for people. And again, system one, all our heuristics that we use, mental shortcuts, it's useful most of the time. So don't think of them as bad. So it's useful, it saves us time. And system two, it can be useful as well for thoughtfully thinking through processes, but it doesn't mean that it's going to always be useful, because we could have the wrong processes, the wrong method in place. And as for changing behavior, it's all about diagnosing the drivers and the barriers in the environment, as well as the psychological drivers, and then using the psychological literature, the behavioral science literature, to inform techniques and interventions to change that behavior. And when I talk about behavior, I mean very targeted behavior. It's very specific behavior.
Beautifully said. Lastly, how can people get in contact or find out more about you before we shut down the the communications?
I think there's two ways. So feel free to follow me on Twitter, social_intel15, I believe it is. It's been a while since I actually looked at that handle. And connect with me on LinkedIn, Isaac Baker, PhD scholar, I believe it is. So feel free to connect, and we can talk behavioral science.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Isaac. Appreciate you coming onto the show. If you enjoyed this podcast, please support it by going to iTunes and putting a review, subscribe, share it via social media, and tell others about it. Start a conversation. It's listeners like you that make this able and possible, and why we bring in these guests to go out and share their knowledge and resources. And just lastly, if you are a psychologist and you want to go out and be part of a bigger team, develop your experience and get into some exciting work, come to strategicpsychology.com.au/careers and reach out. I'd love to hear from you.